there's a distinction between what we would call symbolism and what we would call allegory. Allegory would be a made-up story, a story that isn't true, never was meant to be true, but it serves a message, such as Animal Farm, some sort of metaphor on capitalism and the Russian Revolution. Then you have what's called symbolism. Now, symbolism emerges from a potentially historically true event. It doesn't have to be, it could be a story that's made up, but it still can emerge from what we would call a historical reality. For example, the dropping of the atomic bomb was symbolic. It definitely happened, but there's something that is symbolic about it. It means there is something more than the simple event that we learn from, that we are able to take away, that is distilled into the event. We're going to discuss that in the context of Genesis, because what Rav Yosef Albo does is he sees the book of Genesis as being an introduction, specifically the first 4 chapters, as being an introduction to the rest of the book. And without this introduction, or what he would call a philosophical roadmap, the rest of the book doesn't really make sense. There are certain fundamental principles that you have to rely on, some sort of, you could call it foundationalism, certain axioms that are necessary to be able to build everything else on. He does something similar when it comes to the notion of free will, but I'll get to that in a moment. So what does he do? And I'll give out sort of the landscape, and then we'll delve into it on a perhaps deeper level. So what does he do? He says the first 4 chapters of Genesis are not teaching us history, they're teaching us principles, concepts in the language of narrative. What are they? The first one is his first principle, the existence of God, an independent existence, not some sort of like forced existence. That's his first principle, and he sees it emerging at the beginning of Genesis, and we'll go through it. The second principle is the concept of law, that God communicates with mankind, that God has expectations of mankind. This you see loosely in the story of the Garden of Eden, with Adam and Chava, and the tree of good and evil, and the serpent. And then lastly, his third principle, which is reward and punishment, or providence, or it actually matters. He sees this play itself out in the story of Cain and Abel. So you would sort of have what's happening with Adam and Eve being a more general story about the nature, God's involvement with humanity and expectations on a klal level, or a level of generalities, and then you would have the same, but on the level of individuals when it comes to Cain and Abel. So let's work our way through this. Just to recap, for those of you who are just joining us now, Rav Yosef Albo is looking at the classic idea of principles in Judaism, and he's breaking it apart. He's approaching it in a unique way. He's asking what is actually essential, and he comes with 3. He dismantles and takes apart and pushes aside other people's ideas, such as the coming of the Messiah is a principle. He says, I might think it's true, but I wouldn't call it a principle. A principle is that without it, the structure falls. It's more of a window rather than a concrete pillar. So he has his 3, and he sees these play themselves out in many areas of Jewish thought. In Perek Chelek, he sees Chazal saying everyone who doesn't have a share in the world to come, it lists 3 people. And each one of those 3 people, he says, mirrors his principles of these 3 roots. There are branches to the roots, but the roots are, and using the language of Chazal, an Epicurean, which is going to be the sort of dismantling of the belief in God, resurrection of the dead, which is going to be your purpose and reward and punishment, and changing the Torah, which is going to be signaling to the idea of a divine law. So you have your 3 principles. But now, what Rav Albo does is he takes us through the story of Genesis and gives us a symbolic, philosophical read of the story. And why is this important? First of all, because it's quite a cool take. It's quite unique to look at it purely through a symbolic lens. Now, it's worth pointing out, later on he does say the wise amongst us will take this as happening as well. But, I mean, for the way he's describing it, he seems to imply quite heavily that the only purpose of the first 4 chapters of Genesis are to teach us these principles, and evidence to this is that history only begins in chapter 5, where it says, and these are the generations of man. Excuse me. So he looks at the beginning of chapter 5 as the opening of the book, and before that is your foundations. Now, he uses this principle in another place where he discusses free will. And I try to develop this in perhaps a creative way, and I'm not sure it really worked out, but I'll give you the bare bones of it. He discusses free will, and he says, why isn't free will a principle? And he says because you kind of need it for all law. Now, if we remember, he understands there are three levels of law. There's natural law, which is the rules of the jungle, and there's conventional law, which allows society to flourish, and then there's divine law. His project is trying to understand what is at the root of divine law. Free will isn't. Free will isn't at all. Now, a person may say you need it for divine law, perhaps, but not per divine law, per conventional law as well. To have any system of law, you need to have free will. You need to assume free will to be able to have any sort of conventional law. And this, I think, is a really creative move, because he's basically saying that if you come up to me and say to me, hi, I am questioning free will, you're coming off the back of a society that exists in the framework of conventional law, which means you've already accepted free will. Meaning you're soaring off the branch you're standing on. To undermine the very thing that brought you here and question its validity is a bit of a sort of, you could call it a performative contradiction. What I try to do, he points out as well that the Torah emphasizes the importance of free will, not because it's trying to prove it, but because you could be tempted away from it because of astrology or Epicureanism, the idea that we are just floating balls of matter based off Democritus's atoms, that everything is accidental. There's no purpose or structure behind it. And the Torah emphasizes and pushes the importance of free will through statements like, I've placed before you good and evil, life and death, choose good, those sort of things, because it's trying to push us in a direction, not so much argue for its truth. Which is an interesting point, because philosophically you can't really argue for free will. It's sort of pre-philosophical, meaning it's looking for an uncaused cause. Your free will is sort of apart from all causation, you decided. There's something wrong with that on a purely logical basis. What do you mean apart from everything? Where's the choice emerging from? But the problem is, the minute you start explaining where the choice emerges from, you've kind of lost the ball, because then you've pointed to a cause. But putting that to one side, what I was trying to do on a creative level is Alvin Plantinga, a Christian philosopher, does an interesting move, and perhaps you guys can think of a way of squaring the circle. He shows that a person who's arguing for a materialist evolutionary theory, materialist in the sense that it's devoid of any sort of divine purpose, not attacking evolutionary theory per se, but the idea of it being purely mechanistic and purely natural. So what in essence are you doing? You're proposing to me a truth of evolution. The very process of evolution is developed to promote survival, not truth. If it did, it would be accidental. There's no reason it pursues truth. It doesn't pursue truth, it pursues survival, in which case the very mechanism that you are using to promote a truth undermines the idea of truth. It undermines the idea that it would give you truth, it would give you survival, which gives you a good reason to question whether it's true or not. That's the bare bones of it. I thought that was quite similar with Rav Yosef Albo and the idea of free will, and you sort of coming at me and soaring off the tree of the society that brought you here to discuss free will. So these are what he means by axioms. There are certain assumptions, like when it comes to geometry. When you talk about a triangle, you need a point and a line. You can't prove the point in your line from geometry. That's not how it works. You have to have certain assumptions. So let's talk about this symbolic read of the Genesis story. And also, before I begin, there's an interesting point when the Ibn Ezra, another earlier thinker in the Jewish tradition, talks about the idea of the way he describes his understanding of Genesis. Once again, seems to be that he's taking a very let's call it a very symbolic approach to things. And his commitment to its historicity isn't so clear, but he constantly tells you he is committed to it. And the Abarbanel, or Don Yitzchak Abarbanel, one of the later thinkers of this tradition, says, almost methinks you protest too much. I believe the metaphor he gives is like the pig who puts its hoofs out to try and show you it is kosher, but it's not. You're protesting too much. And he sort of accuses the Ibn Ezra of doing something a little bit. He still obviously uses and respects the Ibn Ezra, but he thinks the Ibn Ezra is protesting too much about his commitment to the historicity of it over the ideas that are beneath it. So, what does Rabbi Yosef Albo do? How does the Torah open up? The Torah opens up with God creating the world. And Rav Albo points out that this is done in stages. And this is important because pausing, moving, stopping, deciding implies free will. And this is pushing against a sort of emanation conception of God. So the first point that Genesis is giving us is the existence of God. existence of a free God. And this is important because that's his first principle. But it's not just the existence of something, it's the existence of something that is acting. Now, this, you could ask, why do I need 6 days? Why don't I just do poof, one thing? Rav Shamshon Raphael Hirsch, once again, has a similar sort of description of Genesis in this sort of way that it gives you meaning and purpose. But Albo's point is that by pausing and stopping, you're showing me purpose. You're showing me intention. Intentionality comes about through stopping. We call HaKadosh Baruch Hu Kel Shakai, the one who said die to the universe, because by saying enough implies there's a framework that it fits within. So that's the first principle. The first principle is the existence of God. And he points out in the direction of the Bible critics and higher criticism, what language or what name does it give to God? Elohim, the God of creation, the name of God we use to represent that more universal angle of the Almighty. Moving to our second point. The second point is the idea of law, and it shifts. It shifts to the Garden of Eden. The Garden of Eden is that area of potentiality. It is that area of, it is a garden, it flourishes. Once again, Rav Hirsch does something similar. You are in your own Garden of Eden today. But the metaphor, or the parable, or let's call it the symbolic narrative takes a step further. It describes two people, and they are commanded by God. Meaning, the first thing we know about man in relationship with God is God has expectations of man. This is a prohibition. Do not eat from this tree. It describes the tree of life. And Rav Albo says, well, that is the Torah. That is your commitment to the divine law. But you are told not to eat from a certain tree. There is a prohibition there. So you have the prohibition, you have the garden, and then you have the snake. And he leans on a rabbinic angle that understands the snake as being Samol, the accuser. This is the evil inclination. This is the story of reality. This is the story of the perennial story of our experience. We are in a garden. There is potential. There is what can give us eternal life, and there's what can cause our downfall. And we are commanded to avoid one. We are commanded to avoid evil. But we have the inner inclination. We have the snake, the inner snake, that we have to overcome. And what name for God does it use here? Once again, it uses Elohim, but it also uses the Tetragrammaton. Now, a person might ask, why both now? Well, this is once again a theme that we'll see reoccurring when it comes to Albo. It reoccurs in the sense that you are avoiding certain pitfalls. A pitfall that he's trying to avoid with us is the idea of dualism, forms of Gnosticism. Both the names of God have to be present here. The name of God that illustrates the general, which is Elohim, and Yud-Keh Vav-Keh, the Tetragrammaton, which is that intimate, connected aspect of the Almighty, the one that cares, the one that is involved, to show that these aren't two different entities. The before one, the God of creation, and the present one, Yud-Keh Vav-Keh. No, they must both be there at this stage. But then we have the third stage, and then I'll embellish each one of these. But the third stage is the story of Cain and Abel. Before then was general. It was the story of humanity. It wasn't any particular person. But now we have Cain and Abel. We have Abel, who brings sacrifices to God. Once again, leaning on the Jewish tradition that he gave good sacrifices. He gave the best of his crop. And Cain, who gave the rubbish stuff. And God tried to intervene, warned him. We have God's individual providence, not just general, but God's individual providence, God's individual care, God's desire to educate, God's desire to draw Cain on the correct path. But it doesn't work. And there is punishment. There is justice, but there is mercy. Because Cain is fearful, and God gives him the sign that people will leave him alone. And you have this story wrapped together in a way that illustrates these three principles, the existence of God. And once again, to point out another point, working off an Aristotelian sort of hierarchy, you have baser objects accepting more complex forms, and they work their way up to the highest form, which is humanity. Now, a little bit anthropocentric, but from his standpoint, that's another reason why the Torah works itself in stages. We have the existence of a free God, Elohim. We have the existence of law, command, expectation, where we have Yud-Keh Vav-Keh, the Tetragrammaton, and the name Elohim, to illustrate the giving of law through that story of the garden and the snake. And then we have the idea of expectations on individuals, reward and punishment, God's individual providence. So Rav Albo actually plays this in an interesting sort of other direction. He asks, you know that part of the Bible that says, let us make man. Why us? Nase lonu, why should we make man? B'tzalmenu, kidmosenu, but why us? And this is a question that's often raised, and people discuss it. And as children, you learn the classic answer. The classic answer is that God is teaching humility. But Rabbi Albo takes it in a deeper direction. He asks, well, you're illustrating something that has a danger. The danger, or the good, must overcome the danger, the bad. The bad is heresy. The good is humility. You could have taught humility in another way. Why do I need to have God saying, let us? Who is he consulting with? And he points out to another tradition within the Jewish world that says God is consulting with his own knowledge. And Alba says exactly. Because till now there had been two types of creation. The celestial, from his standpoint, that which is eternally permanent. The spheres, the realities that are above the natural world. And that which is not permanent, that decays, the natural world. What is God doing when God creates man? God is making this hybrid, this unified entity called man. Man is unified in a way that nothing else in creation is. And that's really important, because what does it mean God said, let us make man? It's because God is showing that both these aspects, being unified in man, emerge from one God. Once again, the importance of pushing away Gnosticism or pushing away dualism on the most fundamental level. The one thing that created the permanent also created the impermanent, and mankind is a duality of the permanent and the impermanent, which feeds perfectly to the idea of reward and punishment, because reward and punishment are that which we receive in the thereafter. The thereafter implies a permanence that the rest of the natural world doesn't share. He also develops this, that when the Torah refers to, for example, Avram mentions names twice. On the one side, it's representing the archetypical impermanent, and the other side, the permanent. Once again, these ideas play themselves out throughout his work. So let's recap our discussion. We spoke about the distinction between allegory and symbolism. Perhaps it's an arbitrary distinction, but I think it's useful in this context, because if a person wants to say, I take deep, profound meaning from the story of Genesis, but they want to hold on to a historicity of it, once again, I'm not exactly sure what that would mean. You'd probably have to be very esoteric when you talk about the it actually happening, but you also want to walk away with a deep meaning and the substance that these stories are giving us. Because as children, you sort of learn them as history stories. Albo's like, no, history starts at chapter 5, not now. This is a prerequisite. This is your user manual. This is, and a person may say, why don't you give it to me in the language of philosophy? Well, because no one would understand it. You're talking to people for the past 3,000 years. Yes, today you might be sophisticated, but back then they were not. I mean, let me rephrase that. They were sophisticated, but in a different way. This is how you taught deep ideas. This is how you gave over deep ideas, through narrative. This is the foundation, the axioms. Like a point and a line is to a triangle, this is to the understanding of divine law. The parallel, the idea of free will, that is a prerequisite to this conversation. Free will comes first, and then you can have a conversation about divine law. We then spoke about the three stories. The story of creation itself, Elohim, the general, the existence of a God, but a free God. The second, the idea of law, commandment, Yud-Ke, Vav-Ke, and Elohim, the tetragrammaton, and the general name for God, to show these emerge from the same will. And lastly, the idea of individual providence and reward and punishment, emerging in the story of Cain and Abel in a way that shows God's care, expectation, but also his justice and his mercy. And then you begin the story, that these are the generations of man. As always, thank you so much for taking the time, and until next time, have a wonderful week.